The energy shackles around Captain Alina Vasquez's wrists made a sound like singing crystal every time she moved, which was unfortunate because she had developed a nervous habit of fidgeting when people were trying to kill her. The two Zephyrian guards flanking her seemed to find this amusing, if the subtle ear-twitching was any indication. Alina had spent enough time studying xenobiology to recognize species-specific expressions of humor, though she suspected the joke was probably at her expense. "You know," she said conversationally as they glided through another corridor of living architecture, "when the diplomatic corps sent me here, they mentioned I might encounter some cultural differences. They were remarkably understated about the whole, being dragged around in energy handcuffs part of the experience." The guard on her left, Alina had mentally nicknamed him tall, dark, and glowering, actually made a sound that might have been a chuckle. His companion, who she dubbed Captain Sirius, maintained the stoic expression that seemed to be standard issue among Zephyrian military personnel. The palace corridor stretched ahead of them like the inside of some impossible organism. The walls pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that reminded Alina of neural networks, casting shifting shadows that made the whole experience feel like walking through someone's dreams. The floor beneath their feet responded to each step with subtle ripples of light, creating the disconcerting impression that they were treading on water made of stars. Alina had to admit it was beautiful, even under the circumstances. The mission briefings had mentioned Zephyrian biotechnology, but the reality was far more impressive than the dry technical reports had suggested. These people didn't just use living organisms as tools, they seemed to have convinced entire ecosystems to function as architecture. It was either the height of scientific achievement or a really elaborate form of interior decorating. "I suppose asking about the local building codes would be inappropriate," Alina murmured, earning another ear-twitch from tall, dark, and glowering. The truth was, she was stalling. Not just with conversation, though talking helped calm her nerves, but mentally. Every step deeper into the palace took her further from any possibility of escape or rescue, and closer to whatever the Zephyrian queen had planned for the human diplomat who'd been caught in what was either a massive intelligence failure or a deliberate trap. Alina strongly suspected the latter, given how smoothly her capture had proceeded. The mission had started promisingly enough. First official contact between humanity and the Zephyrian Empire, with Alina chosen for her combination of diplomatic experience and xenocultural expertise. The plan was simple: establish preliminary trade relations, assess Zephyrian technology and resources, and lay the groundwork for a formal alliance that would give humanity access to the Outer Rim territories. What nobody had mentioned was that the Zephyrians might have their own opinions about human expansion into their traditional sphere of influence. "Captain Vasquez," Captain Sirius spoke for the first time since her capture, his voice carrying the musical quality that seemed characteristic of his species. "You are wondering about your fate." "Among other things," Alina replied. "Though I have to say, your English is remarkably good. The language programs on Earth suggested it would take months to establish basic communication." "We have been studying your species for longer than you might expect," Captain Sirius said, which was simultaneously reassuring and deeply unsettling. "Your linguistic patterns are not difficult to decode once one understands the underlying cognitive structures." Alina wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an insult. "And what do those cognitive structures tell you about humans?" "That you are simultaneously more and less complex than your reputation suggests," tall, dark, and glowering interjected. "Your individual psychology is remarkably sophisticated, but your collective behavior patterns are often crude and predictable." "Charming. I can see why diplomatic relations have been going so smoothly." They passed through an archway that dilated like an iris to admit them, then sealed itself behind them with a sound like a satisfied sigh. Alina added living doorways to her growing list of Zephyrian innovations that would probably revolutionize human architecture if anyone on Earth ever got the chance to study them. The corridor beyond was wider than the previous passages, with walls that curved organically upward to form a vaulted ceiling. Bioluminescent organisms clustered in patterns that might have been decorative or functional. With Zephyrian technology, the distinction seemed largely meaningless. The air carried a faint scent of ozone, and something Alina's brain wanted to classify as green, though she couldn't identify any obvious plant life. "Captain Vasquez," Captain Sirius said, "you should understand that Queen Lyrale does not grant audiences lightly. Your species has not distinguished itself in recent interactions with our people." Alina's diplomatic training kicked in automatically. "I'm sure there have been misunderstandings on both sides. Cultural differences can create unintended conflicts, but with goodwill and open communication." 3 Zephyrian research stations destroyed, tall, dark, and glowering interrupted. 17 civilian vessels damaged or destroyed. 4 colonies abandoned due to what your people term aggressive expansion policies. "These are not misunderstandings, Captain. These are hostile actions." Alina felt her stomach drop. The mission briefings had mentioned some minor territorial disputes, but nothing on the scale her guards were describing. Either Earth's intelligence services were catastrophically uninformed, or someone had deliberately sent her into this situation without adequate preparation. "I wasn't aware the situation had escalated to that extent," she said carefully. "No," Captain Sirius agreed. "You were not, which raises interesting questions about what your government chose to tell you and what they chose to conceal." They reached another iris door, this one significantly larger and more ornate than the previous barriers. The bioluminescent patterns around the entrance were more complex, forming geometric shapes that seemed to shift and flow even as Alina watched. She had the distinct impression that the door was studying her as much as she was studying it. "Queen Lyrale will determine whether you are complicit in your species' aggression or merely ignorant of it," tall, dark, and glowering said. "For your sake, Captain Vasquez, I hope it is the latter." The iris dilated, revealing a chamber beyond that made Alina's breath catch in her throat. The throne room was vast, its living walls rising to heights that disappeared into bioluminescent fog. And there, at the chamber's heart, sat a figure that could only be the Zephyrian queen herself. Alina's first thought was that the briefings had been completely inadequate in describing Zephyrian physiology. Her second thought was that she was probably about to die. Her third thought, somewhat inappropriately, was that she really should have requested hazard pay for this assignment. The throne room was less a chamber than an ecosystem, and Alina was beginning to understand that with Zephyrian architecture, that distinction was probably meaningless. Bioluminescent organisms cascaded from the ceiling like living chandeliers, their light patterns shifting in response to movements and sounds below. The floor beneath her feet was warm and slightly yielding, covered in what looked like moss but felt more like a carpet that happened to be photosynthetic. Queen Lyrale herself defied every expectation Alina had formed during her diplomatic training. The mission briefings had mentioned that Zephyrian physiology was generally humanoid with distinctive cranial features, which was about as useful as describing a symphony as generally musical with distinctive acoustic properties. The queen was tall, even seated, with the elegant bone structure and elongated ears that marked her species, but there was something in her bearing that transcended mere physical presence. She radiated authority the way stars radiate light, not as a conscious choice, but as a fundamental property of what she was. Her clothing appeared to be grown rather than woven, flowing organic materials that shifted color subtly as Alina watched, probably responding to temperature or mood or some other biological indicator that humans hadn't learned to recognize yet. "Approach," the queen said, and Alina was surprised by the musical quality of her voice. Not the artificial harmony of a synthesizer, but the complex acoustic richness of wind through crystal formations. Alina walked forward, her energy shackles chiming with each step, and tried to remember the cultural briefings about Zephyrian protocol. Unfortunately, those briefings had been approximately 3 sentences long, consisting mainly of "be respectful" and "try not to start an interstellar incident." She was beginning to suspect that Earth's diplomatic preparation had been somewhat inadequate. The Queen's personal guard formed a semicircle around the throne, and Alina revised her earlier assessment of Zephyrian military capabilities upward by several orders of magnitude. These weren't soldiers wearing armor. They were something approaching organic war machines. Their biosuits seemed fused directly to their bodies, creating seamless integrations of flesh and technology that moved with inhuman grace and precision. "Captain Alina Vasquez of the Terran Diplomatic Corps," Queen Lyreley said, and Alina realized with a start that the Queen knew exactly who she was. "You have traveled far from your homeworld to visit my court." "Your Majesty," Alina replied, attempting what she hoped was an appropriately respectful bow. "I'm honored by this audience, though I confess the circumstances weren't quite what I'd anticipated." Something that might have been amusement flickered across the Queen's features. "Yes, your arrival was rather more dramatic than typical diplomatic protocols would suggest. Tell me, Captain, what did your government tell you about the purpose of your mission here?" Alina felt the weight of the question settling around her like a physical presence. The bioluminescent patterns on the walls seemed to brighten slightly, and she had the unsettling suspicion that they were responding to her emotional state. Being a diplomatic envoy was challenging enough without having your anxiety levels broadcast to everyone in the room via organic mood lighting. "I was told that this would be humanity's first formal contact with the Zephyrian Empire," Alina said carefully. "The goal was to establish preliminary trade relations and explore the possibility of future cooperation between our civilizations." "And what did they tell you about the current state of relations between our peoples?" Alina's diplomatic training screamed warnings about walking into conversational traps, but the Queen's tone suggested that evasion would be more dangerous than honesty. "I was briefed about some territorial disputes in the Outer Rim sectors. My understanding was that these were minor disagreements that could be resolved through negotiation." The Queen's expression didn't change, but several of the guards shifted slightly, their bioarmor making soft clicking sounds that might have been weapons systems powering up. Alina tried to appear calm while mentally calculating the distance to the nearest exit, which appeared to be approximately impossible to reach. "Minor disagreements," Queen Lyreley repeated, and there was something in her voice that made Alina's skin crawl. "Captain Vasquez, are you familiar with the Kepler station incident?" Alina's heart sank. "I know there was some kind of accident at a research facility. Equipment malfunction, I believe." "Equipment malfunction." The Queen stood, and Alina was struck by how the living architecture of the room seemed to respond to her movement, bioluminescent patterns flowing upward like rising flames. "Captain, Kepler Station housed 47 Zephyrian researchers studying mineral extraction techniques. It was destroyed by weapons fire from a human military vessel. There were no survivors." The words hit Alina like a physical blow. Equipment malfunction, that's what the briefings had called it. An industrial accident, regrettable but unrelated to diplomatic initiatives, not a massacre. "I wasn't told," Alina said quietly. "Your Majesty, I swear to you, I had no knowledge of any deliberate hostile actions." "No, I don't believe you did." The Queen began to pace, and Alina noticed that her footsteps caused ripples of light to spread across the living floor. "Which raises fascinating questions about what your government chooses to share with its diplomatic representatives." Alina's mind raced through the implications. If the Queen was telling the truth, and Alina's instincts suggested she was, then Earth's leadership had sent her here either as a sacrificial lamb or as a test of some kind. Neither option was particularly encouraging for her life expectancy. "Your Majesty, if I may ask, why am I here? If relations between our civilizations are as bad as you suggest, Why grant me an audience at all? Queen Lyrale stopped pacing and fixed Alina with a gaze that seemed to see through diplomatic conditioning and straight into her soul. Because, Captain Vasquez, I wanted to determine whether humans are uniformly duplicitous or merely poorly informed. Your reaction suggests the latter, which is both encouraging and deeply troubling. Troubling, if your government is willing to sacrifice its own diplomatic personnel to maintain plausible deniability. What does that suggest about their ultimate intentions toward my people? Alina had no answer for that, partly because she was beginning to suspect the Queen was right. The mission parameters had been deliberately vague, the cultural briefings inadequate, and the intelligence reports apparently fictional. She'd been sent here blind, and only now, Your Majesty, Alina said, abandoning diplomatic caution in favor of direct communication. I think my government sent me here expecting me to fail. The question is whether they wanted me to fail diplomatically or personally. For the first time since Alina had entered the chamber, Queen Lyrale smiled. It wasn't a particularly reassuring expression. Queen Lyrale's smile was the kind that made Alina think of predators who had just spotted particularly interesting prey. The bioluminescent patterns around the throne room shifted to sharper, more angular configurations, and even the air seemed to carry a different charge. Alina had the distinct impression that she just walked into the most important conversation of her life, assuming she lived long enough to finish it. Captain Vasquez, the Queen said, settling back onto her living throne, which responded by adjusting its shape to accommodate her posture. You have an interesting perspective on your government's motivations. But perspectives, however insightful, do not undo actions already taken. Alina felt the weight of those words settling around her like a funeral shroud. The energy shackles around her wrists seemed heavier now, their crystalline humming taking on an ominous quality. Around the chamber, the Queen's guard maintained their positions with the patient stillness of professional killers waiting for orders. Your Majesty, I understand that my species has caused harm to yours, Alina said, choosing her words with the precision of someone defusing a bomb. But surely the actions of some humans don't condemn all of us. Don't they? Queen Lyrale leaned forward slightly, and the throne's living surface rippled in response to her movement. When your military vessels destroy our research stations, they carry the flag of the Terran Federation. When your colonies encroach on our territorial claims, they do so under the authority of your government. When your diplomats arrive in our space, they speak for your entire species. Alina opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. The Queen was right and they both knew it. Individual intentions meant nothing when measured against governmental actions. Alina might be personally innocent, but she was also personally irrelevant in the larger scope of interstellar politics. However, the Queen continued, and Alina felt a flicker of hope, you have said something that intrigues me. You believe your government intended for you to fail. Why? Alina considered her answer carefully. This felt like the kind of moment where honesty might be the difference between life and death, but the wrong kind of honesty could still get her killed. Because sending an inadequately briefed diplomat to negotiate with a civilization we've apparently been attacking is either incompetence on a scale that defies belief or a deliberate attempt to create a scapegoat. And which do you believe it is? Both, probably. Incompetence in the planning, deliberate sacrifice in the execution. Alina surprised herself with her own bitterness. I've spent my entire career believing that diplomacy could prevent conflicts, that rational beings could find peaceful solutions to their disputes. It's starting to dawn on me that my government might not actually want peaceful solutions. Queen Lyrale was studying her with the focused attention of a scientist examining a particularly fascinating specimen. You sound disappointed in your own species, Captain. I'm disappointed in my leaders. My species is capable of better. We just don't always choose better. Alina met the Queen's gaze directly, abandoning the last pretense of diplomatic protocol. Your Majesty, If you're going to execute me, I'd prefer you do it for something I actually did, not for the crimes of people who sent me here to die." The silence that followed Elena's words was so complete that she could hear the subtle biological processes of the living architecture around them. The guards remained motionless, but Elena sensed a shift in their attention, as if her statement had somehow changed the fundamental nature of the situation. Queen Lyrale stood again, and this time the bioluminescent patterns followed her movement like living flame, casting dancing shadows across the organic walls. She walked closer to Elena, close enough that the human could smell the faint ozone scent that seemed to cling to all Zephyrian technology. "Captain Vasquez," the Queen said softly, "I am going to ask you a question. Your answer will determine not only your fate, but potentially the future relationship between our civilizations. Do you understand?" Elena's mouth had gone dry, but she managed to nod. "I understand, Your Majesty." "The question is this. Why should I not execute you for the crimes your species has committed against mine?" The words hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Elena could feel the weight of expectation from every living thing in the chamber. The guards, the Queen, even the bioluminescent organisms seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. This was the test, the moment that would define everything that came after. Elena's diplomatic training offered a dozen different responses. She could appeal to the Queen's mercy, pointing out that she was an innocent caught up in events beyond her control. She could invoke the principles of interstellar law, arguing that executing diplomatic personnel was a war crime regardless of previous actions. She could offer herself as a hostage or bargaining chip, suggesting that her death would serve no strategic purpose. But looking into Queen Lyrale's eyes, Elena realized that all of those responses would be wrong. This wasn't a diplomatic negotiation. It was something far more fundamental. The Queen wasn't looking for clever arguments or strategic positioning. She was looking for truth. Elena took a deep breath, feeling the energy shackles shift around her wrists, and made her choice. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "you shouldn't execute me because I don't represent the humans who committed those crimes. I represent the humans who want to do better, and we can't learn how to do better if you kill us before we have the chance." The silence that followed was different from the previous pause. This wasn't expectation. This was evaluation. Elena could feel the Queen weighing her words, measuring them against some internal standard that Elena couldn't begin to guess at. The bioluminescent patterns on the walls had shifted again, this time to softer, more complex configurations that reminded Elena of neural networks or star maps. The living architecture seemed to be processing her response, analyzing it for sincerity or deception or some other quality that only Zephyrian biotechnology could detect. Queen Lyrale's expression was unreadable, but something in her posture had changed. The imperial judgment was still there, but it was tempered now by what might have been surprise or curiosity or something Elena didn't have a name for. When the Queen finally spoke, her words were so quiet that Elena had to strain to hear them. "That," Queen Lyrale said, "was not the answer I expected." The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, vibrating with possibilities that Elena couldn't begin to calculate. Queen Lyrale stood motionless, her elongated ears twitching slightly in what Elena was learning to recognize as deep concentration. The bioluminescent patterns throughout the throne room had settled into a slow, rhythmic pulse that reminded Elena uncomfortably of a massive heartbeat. "Your Majesty," Elena ventured when the silence had stretched beyond her ability to endure it. Queen Lyrale's response was unexpected. She laughed, not the cruel amusement Elena had been dreading, but something that sounded almost like genuine surprise. "Captain Vasquez, in my experience, most beings faced with execution either beg for mercy or proclaim their innocence. You've done neither. Would either response change your decision?" "No, but your actual response might." The Queen walked back toward her throne, but instead of sitting, she paused beside one of her guards. Commander Thex, your assessment of the human statement. The guard Alina had mentally dubbed Captain Sirius stepped forward slightly. Her stress indicators suggest sincerity, Your Majesty. Heart rate elevated but steady, no indication of deliberate deception. Her pheromone profile is consistent with fear mixed with determination, not desperation or calculated manipulation. Alina blinked. You can detect all that just by standing near me. Enhanced sensory apparatus, Commander Thex replied. Standard for palace security. We monitor emotional states, physiological responses, and biochemical markers as a matter of routine. Right, of course you do. Alina was beginning to understand why diplomacy with the Zephyrians had been so challenging. How do you negotiate with people who can literally smell your lies? I don't suppose there's any point in asking for privacy during sensitive conversations. Rarely, Queen Lyrale said, but there was something in her tone that made Alina look at her more carefully. Though there are exceptions to most protocols, given sufficient cause. The Queen made a gesture so subtle that Alina almost missed it. A slight movement of her left hand, fingers spread in what might have been a casual stretch. The effect on her guards was immediate and dramatic. They stepped back in perfect unison, moving away from the throne until they formed a loose perimeter around the chamber's edges. Further, the Queen said quietly. The guards retreated through various iris doors until Alina could no longer see any of them. She found herself alone in the vast throne room with the most powerful individual in the Zephyrian Empire, and the energy shackles around her wrists had never felt more inadequate as restraints. Your Majesty, Alina said carefully, I'm honored by this show of trust, but I have to ask, is dismissing your guards entirely wise? I mean, I'm obviously not much of a threat, but still. Captain Vasquez, if I believed you were a threat to me personally, no number of guards would be sufficient protection. Queen Lyrale settled back onto her throne, which adjusted its configuration to something that looked almost conversational. And if you're not a threat to me personally, then guards are unnecessary for this discussion. Alina considered pointing out the logical flaws in that reasoning, then decided that questioning the tactical decisions of an alien monarch might not be her brightest idea. What discussion would that be, Your Majesty? The one where you explain to me how humans who want to do better can be distinguished from humans who are simply better at concealing their hostile intentions. The Queen's expression was intent but not hostile, more like a scholar posing a particularly challenging research question. Alina felt the weight of the moment settling around her again. This wasn't just about her individual survival anymore. It was about whether two civilizations could find a way to coexist, or whether they were doomed to the kind of escalating conflict that would end with one species extinct and the other traumatized by genocide. I don't know if they can be distinguished, Your Majesty, not from the outside anyway. Alina chose her words carefully, aware that honesty was her only viable strategy. But I can tell you how to recognize the difference from the inside. Continue. Humans who want to do better ask questions about the consequences of their actions. They seek information about other species instead of making assumptions. They're willing to admit when they're wrong, even when it's embarrassing or politically inconvenient. Alina paused, thinking about her own government's apparent deceptions. And they don't send their diplomats into situations without adequate preparation, because they actually want diplomacy to succeed. Queen Lyrale nodded slowly. And you believe you represent this category of human? I hope so, but hoping isn't the same as knowing, and I'm not sure any of us can be completely objective about our own motivations. Alina met the Queen's gaze directly. What I can tell you is that I came here genuinely believing that humans and Zephyrians could find common ground. Learning about the attacks on your people hasn't changed that belief. It's made me more determined to find solutions. The bioluminescent patterns around the chamber had shifted again, this time to configurations that reminded Alina of complex mathematical equations or musical scores. The living architecture seemed to be processing not just her words, but some deeper layer of meaning that human senses couldn't detect. Captain Vasquez, are you familiar with the concept of evolutionary convergence? Alina blinked at the apparent change of subject. The tendency for unrelated species to develop similar traits in response to similar environmental pressures. It's a basic principle in xenobiology. Indeed. And what environmental pressures do you suppose would cause two different species to develop diplomatic institutions, trade agreements, and interstellar communication protocols? Alina felt understanding dawning slowly. The need to resolve conflicts without resorting to mutual destruction. Precisely. Both our civilizations have developed these institutions because, at some fundamental level, we recognize that cooperation serves our interests better than conflict. Queen Lyrale stood again, and this time her movement seemed less intimidating and more purposeful. The question is whether that recognition can overcome the immediate political advantages of hostility. What would it take, Your Majesty, to give cooperation a chance? Truth, Captain Vasquez. Complete, uncomfortable, politically inconvenient truth. The Queen walked closer, and Alina noticed that the energy shackles around her wrists had stopped humming. Your government has concealed information from you. Mine has concealed information from me. Both of our military establishments have vested interests in maintaining conflict. Both of our political systems reward leaders who promise victory over compromise. Alina nodded, understanding dawning. But if individuals from both sides were willing to share what they actually knew instead of what their governments wanted them to know, then we might discover that the real enemies of peace aren't the other species, but the systems that profit from war. Queen Lyrale was close enough now that Alina could see the complex patterns of bioluminescent organisms woven into her clothing, pulsing gently with her heartbeat. Captain, I'm going to make you an offer that neither of our governments would approve of. Alina felt her pulse quicken. What kind of offer? Stay here as my guest. Not my prisoner, my guest, while we attempt to establish the kind of honest communication that our respective diplomatic corps seem incapable of managing. The Queen paused, studying Alina's reaction. Help me prove that humans and Zephyrians can work together when we're not being manipulated by our own institutions. Alina stared at her, trying to process the implications. Your Majesty, if I stay here, my government will assume I've been killed or converted into some kind of asset. And if your people see you collaborating with a human, then we'll both be taking significant personal risks for the possibility of preventing a war that neither of our civilizations can actually win. Queen Lyrale smiled, and for the first time, it looked genuinely warm rather than predatory. Captain Vasquez, I've spent the last hour determining whether you're worth that risk. Your answer to my question suggests that you might be. The energy shackles around Alina's wrists suddenly went dark, their crystalline surfaces losing their luminescent glow. She flexed her hands experimentally, surprised by how light they felt without the constant weight of alien restraints. You're releasing me. I'm trusting you. There's a difference, though I realize the distinction might not be immediately obvious. The Queen returned to her throne, but her posture was relaxed now, conversational rather than imperial. The question is whether you're willing to trust me in return. Alina rubbed her wrists where the shackles had been, thinking about everything that had brought her to this moment. The failed mission, the lies her government had told her, the possibility that honest communication might actually prevent the escalating conflict between their species. It was the kind of opportunity that diplomats dreamed about and rarely encountered, a chance to make genuine peace instead of just managing ongoing hostilities. Your Majesty, Alina said finally, I came here believing that diplomacy could build bridges between our civilizations. I still believe that, even after everything I've learned today, if you're willing to take the risk, so am I. Queen Lyrale's smile brightened, and the bioluminescent patterns throughout the throne room shifted to configurations that Alina could only describe as celebratory. "Excellent, Captain Vasquez. Now, shall we begin the real work of preventing a war?" Alina nodded, feeling something she hadn't experienced since arriving in Zephyrian space. "Hope. Where do we start, Your Majesty?" "With the truth, Captain. All of it. About your government's real intentions, about my people's actual capabilities, and about the forces on both sides that would prefer to see us fail." The Queen leaned forward, her expression intent. "And then we figure out how to make peace so attractive that even our politicians won't be able to resist it." Alina couldn't help but laugh. That might be the most ambitious diplomatic goal I've ever heard. "Then it's fortunate that we're not actually diplomats anymore," Queen Lyreley replied. "We're something much more dangerous. We're individuals choosing to trust each other despite everything our respective institutions have taught us." As Alina looked around the living throne room, with its responsive architecture and organic technology,